Okay, we're on our second lesson in our Judges study as part of our Big Picture Old Testament Bible study. So let's jump back into the Judges. So one thing about the book of Judges is that as you're reading through the book, and some people will argue this, and when I was first reading through it, you naturally want to take it like in a chronological order. You think that, the beginning of the book of Judges happens right after the conquest, and this is like fresh after, Joshua and them went in and conquered the promised land. And then as you read through it, and at the end of the book of Judges, like there's some really nasty things that happen, and you think, wow, over that whole time period of 300 years, the nation gradually sunk into sin. But it's actually not chronological. In the book of Judges, as you're reading through each time period of oppression by the different enemies of Israel, it's actually not in chronological order. The late, like chapter 20 of Judges is actually probably one of the earliest parts of Judges. You know that because it actually makes mention of I think Phineas still being the high priest, and Phineas was he was the grandson of Aaron, who was with Moses. So we know that, it wasn't 300 years later at the end, in chapter 20 of Judges, because, Aaron, the priest's grandson, I mean, it couldn't have been more than, 40, 80 years or whatever. It wasn't like a long time period later. So you kind of look for keys like that to figure out the chronology of the book of Judges. So we talked about how Israel fell into sin. How, we talked about the cycle in Judges where they'd, be at peace, and then they'd fall into sin and do wickedness, and then God would have to punish them and bring oppressors against them, and then they'd finally repent, and God would raise up a judge who would deliver them, and then they'd be at peace again, and then the whole cycle would repeat and repeat. But where did that come from? I mean, we see right in the beginning of the book of Judges that there's just wickedness and idolatry, and yet, just like in the previous few chapters, I mean, this was like the strongest nation with God on their side, and they were conquering the land and defeating their enemies, and all of a sudden now they're worshiping other gods. I mean, here, you had people that saw God part the people that actually made it into the land didn't see God part the Red Sea, but they heard the stories directly from, their parents and grandparents. But they did see how God provided for them in the desert and led them and did miracles with Jericho, and as they conquered the land. And then a short time later, they're actually worshiping other gods. Like, where did all this come from? So we're going to just take a quick look at the fall into idolatry. And it started with the tribe of Dan. This is where the idolatry came in. The tribe of Dan, let's see if I don't know if I have the verse here, but it mentions in Joshua 19:47, there it is, when they were conquering, and the coast of the children of Dan went out too little for them. Therefore the children of Dan went up to fight against Leshem, and took it and smote it with the edge of the sword, and possessed it, and dwelt therein, and called Leshem Dan, after the name of Dan their father. So there's a mention here of the tribe of Dan not having enough land. They didn't conquer enough. The land that they had divided to them was too little. So we get into the time of Judges, and they're cramped. They want to conquer some more land, so they send spies out. But in Judges 18:1, here's that verse. In those days, there was no king in Israel. You'll see this repeated, throughout the book. There's no king. Everybody does what's right in their own eyes. And in those days, the tribe of the Danites sought them an inheritance to dwell in. See, if they would have been obedient to God and kept going and conquering the land, they would have had plenty of space. But they settled, and now they need more land. For unto that day, all their inheritance had not fallen unto them among the tribes of Israel. So they sent spies out. So there was still some land that was under the control of, a bunch of the ites and different enemies of Israel there. So they sent some spies out into the land. And some people say maybe the tribe of Dan was just lazy. In Judges 18, The spies went out and saw the land, and they're like, this land is great. It's at peace. The people are at peace. It would be really easy to take it. And just jump down to verse 9, and they said, arise, that we may go up against them, for we have seen the land, and behold, it is very good. And are ye still? Be not slothful to go and to enter to possess the land. So as Judges is a picture of the Christian life, what is there in our own lives? Maybe we're not, enjoying the peace or the rest that we desire in our lives, because maybe there's still things that need to be done. Maybe there's things that we need to do with our lives, but we're just lazy. So we can look at this as a picture, maybe an encouragement. Don't be slothful. Go after the land. Whatever God has for you, go all the way and take it. But the spies went and saw the land was good. Now, there was a guy named Micah, and he had let me check my notes here. He had a house of gods, and he had one big idol, and there's a whole backstory behind it. He stole money from his mom, and his mom was looking for it, and he came and gave it back to her, and she was so, oh, you're such a good son, just take the money back. And he was like, no, I don't want it. And so she forced him to take it, and he made like a big, huge idol, in his house of idols. And he even hired a Levite. He knew, the Levites were the spiritual tribe. They were the spiritual leaders that ministered in the temple, offered the sacrifices. They were responsible for the spiritual welfare in Israel. So this Micah, had this whole, room or house full of idols, and he actually hires a Levite to be his own personal priest. And because he did that, he actually thought that God would bless him. Let's see if I have the verse. Yeah, in Judges 17:13. Then said Micah, now I know that the Lord will do me good, seeing I have a Levite to my priest. So here we have someone who's thinking that God's going to bless him just because he has something religious in his life. Just because he has a priest, working in his house, even though this priest is offering sacrifices to false gods and, idols, engaging in the paganism of the land, just because he has this, quote unquote, spiritual person in his house, this man thinks that he's going to be blessed. You can see how his whole focus is completely wrong. He's not interested in pleasing God through a relationship with God. He's trusting in religion. He's trusting in works are going to make him right with God. And that's just not going to do anything. So I mentioned the spies. The tribe of Dan sent spies into the land. And as these spies were on their way, they happened to stop by Micah's place, and they met the Levite, and they were like, hey, we're on our way on a mission, we're going to go spy out the land. Can you say a blessing over us? So they, so the Levite, blessed the spies, and they went on their way. And then when they were coming back, the tribe of Dan, the spies, they were happy that this Levite had blessed them. So they said, hey, well, is it better for you to, just be a priest for just this one household here, this one guy? Or how about you come with us and you can be a priest for our whole tribe? So they took him away from Micah and made him their own priest. And in Judges 18:18, and these went into Micah's house and fetched the carved image, the ephod, and the teraphim, and the molten image. Then said the priest unto them, what do ye? And they said unto him, hold thy peace, lay thine hand upon thy mouth, and go with us, and be to us a father and a priest. Is it better for thee to be a priest unto the house of one man, or that thou be a priest unto a tribe and a family in Israel? And the priest's heart was glad, and he took the ephod and teraphim and the graven image, and went in the midst of the people. So the tribe of Dan kind of confiscated, they took this Levite to be their own priest to the whole tribe. So now he's not just ministering in one man's house anymore. This idolatry, he actually took the man's idols and the images and brought them with him and used them in his own pagan worship for the whole tribe of Dan. And this actually set up the competitive religion in Israel, and really was where all this idolatry and paganism and like going after idols and stuff, this is where it came in. Because we read through most of the Old Testament where it's just, they're always going after idols and worshiping other gods. And, if you ever asked yourself, well, where did that come from? Where did that start? This is where it actually started, where all this idol worship and the groves and the graven images and worshiping Baal, it all started with the tribe of Dan and taking this Levite priest from one man who had a house of gods and brought him into their tribe. And from him, like becoming like the official, false religion of the tribe of Dan, then that spread throughout the rest of the tribes and throughout Israel. And we also see right at the beginning of the timeline of Judges, just not only the fall into religious apostasy, but moral apostasy. And this is where I was saying in Judges 20, which is late in the book of Judges as you're reading it, but Phinehas is still the high priest, and he's Aaron's grandson, so we know that this isn't long after the conquest. So there was a story in Joshua 19 about a Levite and his concubine, and she ran off. He went to get her, and the Benjamites attacked and killed the concubine. And the Levite took and chopped her up and sent her in pieces to like all the other tribes to show like what a huge tragedy had happened. And the rest of the tribes got together, and here we're like just into the time of Judges. We're just settling into the land, and they've got a civil war. So and this is all like not long after Joshua and the conquest and all the great things that God did to get them in the land. This was one generation. We had a whole nation that went from following God, trusting God, God working in their lives and doing miracles and blessing them, to gross idolatry, gross immorality, just wickedness and sinfulness in one single generation. And this is where we need to take it to heart in our own lives, our own nation, as we see our nation slowly spiraling down and getting worse and getting worse. And, if you have any doubt that we're in the end times, because this has to happen and this has to happen, this can all happen relatively quick. In the course of, look at where our country has come just in the last 20 years, 40 years, one generation, where now, you can't even put a manger scene on your front lawn anymore, where we used to have 50 years ago prayer in school. Now like you can't even put a something on your lawn trying to honor God in whatever way you're trying to do. So it can change really fast. In one generation, the whole nation can sink drastically. The tribe of Benjamin through the Civil War was almost wiped out. And we're going to move on to, I'm going to take a look at the different, you can divide the book of Judges up into different periods of oppression. Who was the main enemy at the time that was persecuting and bringing the judgment against the Israelites. So we'll start with the Mesopotamian oppression. King Cushan Rishathaim, he's the king of the Mesopotamians at the time. Cushan. And, it's just kind of interesting as you're going through. Yes, you can read it as like a history, and, there's a lot of, either movies or kids shows that can be made, and you just look at the the cool things that happen, Samson, going and killing people and knocking down the temple, and there's like interesting things like that. But there's a lot of practical little things that you can get if you look at the lives of the people that God used, the people that God brought as the oppressors, what they did that was wrong, that angered God. In this case, it mentions that it was all the intermarrying. Here you had God trying to keep this monotheistic, holy people that would just worship him, and they went and started intermarrying with all these pagan people that were around them and bringing their idolatry into Israel. So God had to bring judgment against them from Mesopotamia. The judgment, the oppression lasted for 8 years, and then they repented and God raised up Othniel. And again, this is, early in the time period, because, here's Othniel was Caleb's nephew, his son-in-law, and he was from the tribe of Judah. And the notable thing about him that I mentioned in the last lesson was that he was filled with God's Spirit. he delivered them, and they had rest for 40 years. Most of these I'll breeze through fairly quick because I don't want to spend weeks on the book of Judges. But then there was the Moabites, and he was led by King Eglon. And I've mentioned this. It's just funny. I'm just so glad that the Bible, like if I was in the Bible, I would not want it to say what it says about him. It literally says he was a very fat man. Just, I'd be embarrassed. I mean, anyway. So their sin at this time that God mentions is that they forgot God. They served Balaam, served the groves. So we've got, the idolatry and serving false gods, and even the nature. I mentioned, I think in the last lesson, how, they elevated the importance of nature and they worship nature above God. And we can kind of see that today with the whole environmental movement. And, I know it's good to, take care of the environment in ways, but in other ways, it becomes just a political excuse that's just used for political power and political gain. So this oppression lasted 18 years, and God rose up Ehud of the tribe of Benjamin. And I had mentioned that he turned his disability or his disadvantage into an advantage. He was left-handed, and he also had apparently some smithing skills. So here's a man who, and this is something I've realized about the judges too. The judges weren't these great natural leaders. These judges were everyday people. They were farmers and workers and smiths possibly, but he obviously knew how to make a dagger. So he used his own natural skills, and God used that as part of the deliverance. So in our own lives, sometimes if we're crying out, God, just do this for me, or give me this, or give me that, we may already have the tools or the skills that we need in order to obtain the deliverance or the victory that we can get. And it's just a matter of realizing what it is that God wants us to use. So he actually used his skills, made a homemade dagger, and ended up killing King Eglon. He went in, said to the king, I've got a secret message for you from God. And the king was like, ooh, a message for me? And he sent everybody out, and he had that dagger in his left hand, and he's like, oh, you king, and he's, showing his right hand. There's obviously no weapon in it, so the king didn't suspect anything. And then he just whipped out his left hand, and, poked him, and he was gone. So he used his disadvantage for his advantage. Shamgar from the tribe of Benjamin was another one. He killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. That's pretty much all it says about him. But I take from that, an ox goad is just a common tool. Something maybe, back then you'd find it in your garage or your barn or your shed or whatever. So God doesn't need you to have some, specialized, expensive equipment or, super special skills or anything high tech. Sometimes you just need to use what you have available. And just like he grabbed his, tool for farming, and he just went out, and God used that to give him the victory. And then they had rest for 80 years. Canaanite oppression, Judges 4-5. The enemy leader there was Jabin. He was the king of Canaan, and Sisera, he was the captain of the host. He was the one that led King Jabin's army. They were known for having many horses and 900 chariots. And as far as the sin, it just says that the children of Israel did evil. Didn't specify exactly what, but evil, I think, is a pretty general term that you can pretty much imagine encompassed everything that would be possible for them to be doing. So the oppression lasted 20 years, and the deliverers were Deborah and Barak. And I believe Deborah was from the tribe of Ephraim, and she was the only female judge. And the thing about Deborah, people who want to, essentially feminists that really want to elevate women in a position of leadership and kind of get things out of order, they look at Deborah and they hold her up as this like amazing hero and this like awesome leader, and this like military commander and strategist, and they really use her as an excuse, or as an example, women should lead. See, there's no problem with women leading. And I know that He has a place obviously for women as much as men, but don't go and try to twist what the Bible says to try to prove that, because it doesn't say anything about her leading armies or coming up with any great strategies. All she did was encourage Barak. She supported him. She obviously had a relationship with God. She heard from God, and she told Barak, hey, God says you need to go and conquer this people. He's ready. You need to go out and you should do that. She didn't personally go out and lead the armies. She told him, and he's the one that went out. And he was, he struggled in his faith and even said, like, okay, well, I'll go, or I won't go unless you go with me. And so she's like, okay, I'll go with you, but you're going to lose the glory of winning the battle. So, but she didn't lead. She just went along as like a supporter and an encourager. She didn't lead the armies, and she didn't fight the battles. God's the one that fought the battles. God used everyday people and worked through them supernaturally to bring the victory. So, I mean, Deborah, obviously, great example from the Bible, great woman. We know she walked with God. She heard from God and was able to pass those messages on to encourage others to follow God and do God's will. But just be careful when you go trying to pull her out as more than what the Bible says. She was no more than the other people in the Bible, the other judges that just were, your everyday people that God spoke through to try to accomplish something. So because Barak was, weak in his faith and wanted Deborah to go along with him, God, usually when a leader rises up and he goes out and conquers and gets the victory, it's like a glorious thing, right? You ride back and you've got the victory, you got the king's head in the bag on your horse or whatever, and everyone's cheering, yeah, you did it. Well, because of his lack of faith, God didn't allow him to get the glory of that victory. So Sisera was out running and fleeing after his army had been conquered, and a woman named Jael was actually the one that tricked him into coming into her tent, and she killed him by nailing a spike through his head. So he lost the glory because he didn't have as strong of a faith as Deborah in this case. And then ultimately King Jabin was killed by the Israelites, and they had rest for 40 years. So I think one of the points I wanted to make with this too is, people want to overuse Deborah as an example of putting women in leadership, and women can do great things, but without even using her as an example, it's just obvious that a faith-filled woman can do more than a faithless man. God can work through a woman. He can accomplish great things. It comes down to faith, not just a matter. I mean, there's different positions and all that. I'm not going to get into the order that God has for men and women, but the important thing is that you have faith and you're trusting God, and a woman of great faith can accomplish great things. Just because you're a man and God is going to use you, I mean, here's an example where he could have accomplished a lot more, but because he was weak in his faith, you had Deborah that gets the glory in a sense in the eyes of history. So moving on to the Midianite oppression. Enemy leaders, kings Zebah and Zalmunna. And God calls out the sin here as Baal worship. And that went on for 7 years. Found my notes here. And the Bible describes this time period as a period of severe oppression. They were driven from their homes. They were driven from their fields where they were growing their food, and they lived in caves. I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but I believe in cavemen, just not as far back as what evolutionists want to. They want us to believe in pre-modern man cavemen that were not as developed as we are now. No, we had back in Israel people living in caves, and in fact, today, right now, there's people living in caves over there. There's wars, there's all kinds of conflict going on in Israel, and I think that these are some Palestinians that, because of the wars and stuff going on in Israel, they've fled their homes, and there's people living in caves right now. They're known for having a multitude of camels. I just wanted to put a little video of camels on there. Strange looking. Cool. And Gideon, I think he's one of the judges that we're more familiar with. We've heard a lot about Gideon, and there is a lot about him that we can learn from. And I kind of wanted to take a little bit more of a look at Gideon. He's from the tribe of Manasseh. He was one of the judges that God directly spoke to. God actually sent the angel of the Lord to speak to him and give him a message and call him into service. So what kind of a man was Gideon? And this is where it just gets kind of interesting when you can just pick a figure out of the Bible and kind of look at his life, look at his responses, how he responded when God called him or asked him to do something. And we can really kind of apply it to our own lives and look for lessons that we can learn from that. And one of the things I take from Gideon, here's, this history looks at him as this great leader, this deliverer, but he's actually a lot like us. Like I mentioned, these weren't like huge, strong men raised in palaces that were trained up to be military leaders and geniuses. They were just average men that were farmers and shepherds, and God used them and raised them up. And he had the same fears and doubts and nervousness that we would. If God was to tell us to do something dangerous or important or threatening, we'd be like, oh man, like really? But he had the same fears, and we see it in his life and how he responded to things. I mean, right from the get-go, when the angel spoke to him, he was like how do I know that this is really true, what you're telling me? And God gave him a sign right off the bat. He had an offering he put down, and God sent down fire in it. I think fire actually came out of the rock. It says fire actually came out of the rock. I'm not sure. It might be the only time that it ever says in the Bible that fire came out of the rock. Usually it comes down from heaven. But this actually says the fire came out of the rock, which might be worth looking into a little more. That's just kind of an interesting distinction. So we got God raising up Gideon. God tells him, I've got a mission for you. I'm going to raise you up. Here's the first thing I want you to do. Tear down your father's altar to Baal and the grove, build an altar to God, and sacrifice your father's 7-year-old bull on it. I mean, how's that for a challenge? Okay, I want to serve you, God. And the first thing God tells you to do is go and defile your father's altar, take your father's bull and sacrifice it on an altar that, you build to me. I mean, one of the most intimidating things in a lot of our lives as we become Christians is our family members that aren't Christians. It's always, it's tough to go back and try to witness to them. They think you're crazy, or if they're of a different, faith that's not truly saved, they're going to just look at you with anger or suspicion. And yet here, God tells them to go and tear down your father's altar. And I think one of the things we can take from that is, like, why do you believe what you believe? Do you believe, do you have the faith that you have just because of your parents? I mean, God's telling him flat out, reject and condemn your father's religion. Reject your parents' faith. And in our own lives, why do we believe? Why do we have the faith that we do? Is it just because our parents have it, because of the way we were raised? Or do we truly seek God and find him? We need to do that on our own terms, through seeking searching the scriptures, prayer, seeking after God. He tells us that if we seek him, we will find him. In Jeremiah 29:13, it says, "And ye shall seek me and find me when ye shall search for me with all your heart." So there's a lot of people searching for God. There's a lot of people that are just looking everywhere, trying to find the peace, peace with God and the peace, but they're not really truly searching with all their heart. Their heart's not, they won't accept it, unless it fits their idea of what God should be, or the religion, what type of religion they should be in. But if you truly seek God with all your heart, God promises you'll find him. It's a promise. You won't spend your whole life searching for God truly with your heart and not find him. It's a promise that you will. So if you don't know God, seek after him and truly mean it with your heart, and you will find him. So he tells him to tear down his father's altar, and Gideon was afraid. He was afraid not only of his father, but also the men of the city. Apparently his father's altar was maybe something that his father was proud of. Maybe it was really nice and expensive, and actually the people of the city knew about this altar. Maybe they came, maybe it was in the center of town or something. So it says he was nervous. He was afraid to do this, just like we would be if God asked us to do something like that. So he did it at night. He didn't just march there in the middle of the day, God told me to do this, and start tearing down the altar. He went there, snuck there in the middle of the night, got help from 10 servants. So when God tells you to do something, it's okay to get help. Sometimes God may ask you to do something that's difficult. There's nothing wrong with, finding some trusted friends or something to maybe help you along with something. So not only he did it at night, and he got some people to help him. So I take from that it's okay to use your brain and not take the hardest path, right? Even this little rabbit here, the rabbit sees there's an easier way instead of trying to climb over that whole thing. If God tells you to go witness to people or something, it doesn't mean you go out and stand in front of the roughest bar in the toughest part of town and start shouting Bible verses at people. You can use your brain and do it in a way that's smarter, not harder. We don't have to take the hardest path and beat our head as hard as possible in order to please God. If he gives you some leeway, use your brain. So the men of the city found out, and they ended up wanting to kill Gideon. So here it says he took trusted servants that helped him do this. But you might want to be careful who you trust, because he did this at night with 10 trusted servants, but somehow the men of the city still found out who did it. So one of his servants must have leaked, that it was them and what they did. So be sure of the people that you're gonna trust. And this was interesting, because the men of the city came and they wanted to kill Gideon. And they came to Gideon's father and they were like, your son tore down the altar and they cut down the trees, send him out here so we can kill him. And his father said, let's see if I have the verse here. Well, basically his father said, if Baal is a god, then let him defend himself. And I went back and forth, and I wanted to maybe get your opinions, because it almost sounds like a wise thing, right? If Baal is such a powerful god, why don't you let him defend himself? Why do you have to go and kill my son? If Baal's really a god, let him do it. Do you think that's him saying maybe he's not the greatest God? Maybe he was leaning towards what Gideon was putting faith in the true God? Or was he really trusting Baal, saying, hey, if Baal's a great God, let him kill him? I wasn't sure which way to go with that, whether he was actually trusting Baal, or if he was, kind of dissing Baal, if Baal's so strong, let him,
I'm sure he didn't want his son killed, and at the same time, he was coming up with that idea of if we all trust in Baal, let's show him, let himself show himself powerful or whatever.
Yeah.
It was a win-win.
Yeah.
They wouldn't have his son thrown to them, and they would just kill him.
Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't sure whether because it could be taken either way. It could be taken as a wise thing, hey, if Baal's really God, let him defend himself. Or it could be foolish if he really was trusting Baal. Well, let Baal take care of him. He's strong. So,
Maybe he was stalling for time because they wanted to rush and get him right away.
mm-hmm.
You know, he could have been stalling for time to see himself what would happen. Because maybe he was on the fence.
Mm-hmm. Could be. Yeah. All right. Moving on. So God, after he did that, it was kind of he was obedient. He obeyed God here, so God moved him on to the next stage of the game. He raised him an army and told him to prepare for war. So Gideon gathered an army, and I think we all know what a fleece is. This is where the term fleece comes from. A fleece is just it's like a piece of wool, a piece of cloth or wool that Gideon had. And here God told him to go out and fight this huge battle. And again, Gideon was just an average guy. He was like you or me, and he was scared. He was like, "Are you sure? I mean, there's an awful lot of them, and they got lots of camels and horses and chariots, and we got a lot of men, but I mean, these, the people that he gathered were probably, farmers and shepherds and other people that weren't professional soldiers. They've been oppressed so bad, they were literally hiding. They would gather their wheat and they'd go and hide and like thresh their wheat like out of sight behind buildings and stuff so that the enemy wouldn't see them. They knew how deadly the enemy was. So he put the fleece on the ground and he told God, if the ground in the morning is wet underneath the fleece, but the fleece is perfectly dry, if the ground was all dewy, but the fleece was dry, then he would know that it was God's will. And that's exactly what happened. The ground was wet, the fleece was dry. But then he went back to God again. He says, okay, well, the next time, can you have the fleece be wet while the ground is dry? And God listened, and the fleece was so soaking wet that he was able to wring out an entire bowl of water, but yet the ground under it was completely dry. So, we use this example of the fleece when like you're testing God. God maybe asks you to do something, or you feel that he's asking you to do something, and we're nervous or we're not convinced about it. It's okay to like ask God, can you just confirm that to me in some way? Can you just really let me know that that's your will? And there's a good chance he'll do it. Maybe he'll speak to you through a Bible verse or through a friend or some circumstances or something that happens. It's okay to have doubts and fears sometimes. It doesn't mean that you're a faithless person. It just means that you're human, and it's okay to just seek some confirmation. And there's the picture of, that's like a fleece. It's just like a chunk of wool or whatever, and it was so soaked. Imagine how that would feel like in the morning if you were him. You go out there and you actually pick up this fleece and it's like totally heavy, soaked with water, and you look and like the ground is perfectly dry. I mean, it's just kind of a cool thing if you actually think about the details of it.
I think that first miracle was more impressive, that the fleece remained dry.
Yeah, sitting on the.
It would soak it in like a sponge.
Yeah. I mean, just like imagine, like if you were that and you're like kind of like walking up to it and peeking under it. It's just, you really kind of put yourself into that circumstance, and how excited you'd be to actually get such a solid confirmation. So he wanted some confirmation from God. And Gideon raised an army of 32,300 men. And God said, that's too many. I mean, how'd you like to be Gideon here? 32,300 men, that's a lot of people. I mean, still you're going against a bigger army that's better trained, has better weapons, has camels, horses, chariots, but yet, 32,000 people. And God says, that's too many people. You need to whittle it down a little bit. So first he said, okay, anybody in your army who's scared, let them go home. And 22,000 people left. That's a good chunk of his army. It's kind of depressing when you go from looking at this huge field of people and then 22,000 of them just leave. Like, okay. And then he did this thing where he took the people to the water, and most of the people just dunked their faces into the water and started drinking. But there was 300 people that dipped their hand in the water and like brought it to their mouths. And I used to wonder, like, why, what would that signify? And it's because those are the people who were more alert of their surroundings. The people that just put their head right down in the water, they're no longer seeing what's around them. They could just be cut off. They're not paying attention to what's going on. But if you reach down, you can drink. You prove like you're an alert soldier, that you know what's going on.
Experience.
Yeah. So like God used that to whittle down the people even further, so that there's only 300. And we've heard this in a lot of stories and examples. Gideon's 300. This is how he came up with his 300 people. So talk about going from 2 HSBC arenas, or what is it now? KeyBank Arena? 2 KeyBank arenas packed full of people, to the amount of people that you can fit into a large commercial airplane. To go against tens and tens of thousands of battle-trained soldiers with all their weapons and camels and chariots. But to make a long story short, God did give him the victory. There's the whole, and this is where I said it's okay not to always take the hardest road. You can. I thought I had a verse there. He took those 300 men and he gave them trumpets, and he gave them torches, and they hid the torches in jars. They came upon the enemy and kind of surrounded them, and they all of a sudden like blew the trumpets in the middle of the night and broke the jars and raised the torches, and it caused such a confusion in the enemy's army that they were killing each other. They didn't know who was coming from where, and his 300 were able to come in and win a victory. So it's working smarter, not harder. God asks you to do something. You don't just, okay, God told me to do it, let's just march right in the middle of their camp in the middle of the day and God will give us the victory. Well, maybe that might be the way that God wants you to do it, but you might take more losses, and it might not be the smartest way to do it. So he actually used his brain and came up with a plan that accomplished everything with, and minimized all the losses. So they had peace for 40 years. And another interesting fact about Gideon was he started the take your child to work practice that we still have today in our culture. In Judges 8:20, after they had conquered the enemy and taken the king captive, he had taken the enemy leader captive, probably had him chained up or tied up. In Judges 8:20, and he said unto Jether, his firstborn, up and slay them. But the youth drew not his sword, for he feared, for he was yet a youth. So here he has this enemy king trussed up and captured, and here he tells his son, you kill him. You can help me out. You came with me to work today. You can take care of this guy. And yet the kid was so young that he was afraid, and like he couldn't. He must have been 10, early teen. I don't know, maybe. And so take what you want from that. It's okay to challenge your kids. Try to encourage them to, be part of the family business. Just because they're young, don't coddle them, and you can test them with things, see what they can handle. And actually, that's where we're going to stop for tonight. So that's it.